Just wanted to say a few words ahead of this video because these videos come off the back of a huge lot of Eaglemoss Star Trek ships that I picked up recently, and so I've put up all the duplicates on eBay for you to have a look at, and I'll include links around and about the place. So if you've got any sort of interest in getting hold of a few of these to have a look at them for yourself, you can do so for a while at least, because it looks like they're not going to go flying off the shelves. I've tried to price them quite reasonably, so do please go and have a look, and without further ado, I will get on with the main video. Cheers. Now, the Oberth class is a ship that I have a lot of personal affinity for. The reason being that many moons ago, when I was first having a little play with creating 3D objects, I created a little fly past of an Oberth class, which I think at the time had probably only really been seen in Star Trek 3. Possibly. I can't even remember if we got into the sort of Next Generation era at that point, but I was using a program called Imagine on the Amiga. So that'll give you an idea of what sort of time frame we're talking about here. But basically, the Oberth class was intended to be quite literally a sort of throwaway ship in the third Star Trek movie. It gets blown up, spoilers, but because it was a throwaway ship, they didn't spend a huge amount of time on it. But it also meant that they didn't want it to look kind of better than the Enterprise, because there were quite a few new ships introduced in that film, and it's the first time we see a Klingon bird of prey, which of course then became completely ubiquitous throughout the rest of Star Trek visual history. But so too, ironically, did the Oberth class. Because we started with the Grissom in Star Trek 3, and that's what this small model is of. And then we actually saw it again in quite an important episode called Pegasus. And that was way down the line in Star Trek The Next Generation. And it's the Pegasus that's pictured on the front cover of the magazine here. And that was NCC-53847. The Grissom was only NCC-638. So the idea is that these little ships have been in service with Starfleet for 100 years, virtually. And they're only 120 metres long. They have a crew complement of 80. Quite how one gets from here to there is debatable, because they're only attached by their nacelle struts. That's it. There's no neck between the primary and secondary hulls. Now, I've read, I think, elsewhere that this sort of pontoon, this canoe, if you like, is actually kind of where all the sensors and stuff live. So it may be that can get sort of swapped out and so on. So maybe people don't actually tend to go in here as much, but you could transport to it. And I think that people have suggested to me that there are, in fact, turbolift shafts in the nacelles which would allow you to get down here. But it is quite a wacky looking design. And when I was looking at it just now as I was reading the magazine, I actually thought that you could actually jettison it. So you could sort of just completely lose these parts. You'd still have warp nacelles, and you'd still have an impulse engine, and you still have your navigational reflector and stuff. So I actually wonder if, the top half could actually be a bit of a lifeboat vessel almost. You could just strap on whatever you needed underneath it. So I don't know quite what the thinking was there. But obviously that does make it quite a distinct look as compared with the Enterprise and indeed the Excelsior, which is another new ship introduced in that film. So what's really fascinating about this, well, to my mind anyway, is also how long the original physical model was actually used for. Because the funny thing is that the Grissom is the same physical model as the Pegasus. So the actual physical model survived for like 20 years or something, and was constantly reused as virtually every other example of an Oberth class in the show, like ever, before the CG version of it got created. There was one other one made, apparently, for an episode where there had to be a really badly damaged Oberth, and for that they actually made another one and damaged that one so they could keep the original model. And they took moulds of the original to make that copy. So it is identical, effectively. But I always really liked them as just as a little runabout ship, because it makes sense that, Starfleet would need transport ships, and they were also used to investigate, astronomical features and so on. So it's kind of interesting that these little guys just sort of, bopping about the place. But this magazine is really, I'm gaining a new appreciation for the magazines in reading them in order to give you a sort of quick flick through them as I'm doing this suite of videos, because there's some really nice screenshots in them, some really interesting articles as well. So if you've never found any of the magazines, if like me, you tended to pick up just the models, I can recommend the magazines because I think you might find them sort of genuinely interesting. So you can see here, this is the original Star Trek 3 Grissom bridge. Very, very scientific, very much rigged for scientific analysis. Only got phasers, not designed for battle, but they were occasionally thrown into battle if they just happened to be around, effectively, But I think they were pretty short-lived, as Star Trek 3 would suggest. Not really sure why you'd bother, but anyway. So you can see here, there's also a really big article here on Star Trek 3 design production as well. So it's kind of, this is really, really interesting to read in terms of the visual effects department actually started to sort of supplant the art department a little bit, because obviously the visual effects kind of became the art department in a way, because obviously so much of it was to do with models, and this was the first time we saw space dock, I think. Is it the first time we saw space dock? I think it probably is, because I think in Star Trek 2 it was a sort of it was the skeletal space dock that we saw rather than the actual starbase kind of space dock. So we've got as you can see here, we've got the Klingon bird of prey, and they were sort of trying to figure out what they actually needed to sort of create versus what they could draw. So this was early days before the CG had really sort of come in. So it's all a mix of traditional visual effects and model work, which is nice to see. So this is the one time when having a lot of lighting isn't that helpful. But you can just see, they were sort of sketching out how Vulcan would look. And of course, there are a lot of really distinctive scenes in Star Trek 3. I do really enjoy it. I particularly enjoy when they're actually trying to leave space dock and get out before the door shut. That always amuses me for some reason. And this is the building and filming of the Oberth class. So you can see here, this is the I think this is the Vico, where it's been very, very badly damaged. But that's the original sketch here, and then that's the model as it was actually produced. But I was really surprised to discover that the Pegasus is actually the Grissom, and that was the Grissom I was showing you there as well. It's just crazy that they'd be the same model sort of travelling down the years, and yet still being filmed and on screen in the same fashion. So that's the naughty admiral from Pegasus who is developing a phased cloak, and again that's a really interesting decision, because he put an experimental phased cloak on a tiny Oberth, but I suppose that might be the last place that anyone would think to find such a high-tech device, but maybe it was just the ship he could borrow. There's also mention as well that civilians could actually occasionally get hold of Oberths for their sort of science studies. So there was an Oberth where it didn't have an NCC registry, it had an NAR registry, which I think was the same with the Raven. From Voyager, I think it had a registry that indicates it's not in service with Starfleet. It's in service with a sort of civilian crew. So just a little aside there. But yeah, I have a soft spot for the Oberth. I like it as the idea of it being a little workhorse, little starships off doing important things. It's kind of like a lower decks kind of ship, isn't it? It's a bit like the California class, I guess. Maybe the California class actually supplanted the Oberth. I don't know. We also saw one in Generations. It's one of the ships that comes to lift the Enterprise crew off the surface after the saucer section has crashed. So when I saw that at the end of the film, I went, "Whee!" Because it was like sort of, it's worth. I did that. I modelled that. I don't know if my animation might even exist. I actually uploaded it to now what was it called? Aminet. It was like an Amiga FTP site. God knows if it still exists, I've no idea. There's probably a little file of it somewhere. But here's the model itself. And at first glance, I really did think this was the Pegasus, but it definitely isn't, because it's definitely NCC-638, and I can actually see with better light on it now, it's definitely the Grissom. So this is the Star Trek 3 Oberth. This is the first Oberth, or the first time we saw the Oberth. And that's really nice as well. That's got some real weight to it. I really like the XL size of the Pegasus model as well, that I've had a look at in the past as well. And there goes my lighting. Let me just readjust slightly. Best Blue Peter styling. Here's a bit more light. So yeah, it's like really well detailed model. I mean, they're not the most exciting ship, admittedly, but I just love the way they've got these little sort of sawn off nacelles. So it's like it's doing its best. But apparently they were capable of quite high warp, and they also they were quite structurally sound because they were designed to sort of survive anomalies and so on. So, you know, I've got a lot of time for these little ships. I don't know quite why. I think it's because they're the underdogs. You know, it's like they're never going to be the flagship of the fleet, but they have their own place and their own utility. And at the end of the day, some poor so-and-so's got to be ferrying people around and taking, you know, vaccines and stuff where they're needed and all that sort of good stuff. And you don't want to waste one of your ships of the line doing that stuff, but you still need it doing. So it makes perfect sense that you would employ the sort of smaller ancillary ships to help fulfill that function. And again, this is one of those models where I probably wouldn't have picked it up consciously. You know, had I not got it as part of this job lot, then I probably wouldn't have bothered with it particularly. But I did get the XL because I just thought it looked really impressive, and the XL is hilariously huge, even compared to some of the sort of hero ships. It's just one of those little sort of Eaglemoss quirks. So let me just try and get the lighting out of your way. So there is the USS Grissom, NCC-638. God bless the Oberth. Bless it. Right, and with that, I shall charge my lighting and then move on to the next. Cheers for now.